The mirror modifier is one of the most useful and common modifiers to use while working with Blender. It's used to duplicate your geometry along one or various axes, so it's a great option to work very fast with symmetrical models, or even create different instances of your mesh. It's important to mention that this modifier is used mostly for polymodeling, and could create some problems if you try to sculpt using the mirror modifier. The sculpt mode has its own option to mirror your strokes, but that's a topic for a future video. Here I have a symmetric model I'm currently working on. If I have to work on both halves independently, it will take a lot of extra work, with the added risk of making an error at some point. The best way to work on this situation is using the mirror modifier. First, I'll delete half of my geometry, because that part is gonna be generated by the modifier. Then you will find it coming to the modifier panel under the Generate section. On the modifier options, I can select the axis I want the mirrored geometry to appear, and moving around some vertices you can see that the modifier automatically replicates those moves on the other side. If I delete even more geometry, I could use the modifier to mirror 2 or even 3 axes at the same time, making work on certain models a lot faster. By the way, an interesting detail to take into account is that most of the tools will work properly while using them on the mirror axis. For example, if you wanna create a circle on the middle of your model, the Circle Loop tool will make use of the mirrored geometry. From time to time it could fail and do some strange things, but restarting the software should fix those errors. At this point, you could find some problems while working with this modifier. For example, after setting the modifier, your geometry could appear like this, both sides clipping through each other. This happens because the modifier creates the new geometry from the mesh origin, and in this case, the origin wasn't at the center. To fix this, I'll move the 3D cursor to the center point of this mesh, and use right-click Origin to 3D cursor so the origin is where it should be for the modifier to work properly. Another problem you may face is that you have set the mirror modifier and the mesh origin is set correctly, but still, the mirrored geometry is not appearing, or appears on a strange place. The problem is right here. The mesh is rotated 90 degrees, so the mirror modifier is getting a bit confused with the axis. You could change the mirrored axis and it can solve the problem, it's a way to do it. But in general, not only when using mirrors, the best practice is to change the transforms as little as possible, and apply transformations using Ctrl A every time you do it. Now the mirror modifier takes the selected axis as it should. Another way to solve those previous problems, and I take this opportunity to continue talking about the different options for the mirror modifier, is using an object as the mirror pivot point. Usually this is done with an empty object. I'll add one to the scene and select that empty as a mirror object for our mesh. Now, instead of the mesh origin, the mirror will appear using the empty as a pivot point, so it's easier to move around or even rotate the mirrored copy. I usually use this option when, for some reason, my model needs the pivot point in a place that is not the center of the model, or most commonly when I want to create instances for the object on a different place. 3 important settings to take into account are the Merge, Clipping and Vertex Groups checkboxes. The first one I'm gonna talk about is Merge, that, as the name implies, when activated it merges the vertices that are close enough to their mirrored counterpart. This distance is determined by the Merge Distance slider, and be careful because sometimes if you are working on a small 3D model, this could make disappear some geometry without you noticing. Next, activating the clipping option will prevent the geometry from clipping through the mirror pivot point. If you get a vertex to the center, it won't be able to go beyond that point, and also all the geometry that was already on the center cannot be moved from there. The last one on the list is vertex groups. When active, if you have created a vertex group on your mesh, then the mirrored counterpart of that geometry created by the modifier will appear on a different vertex group. For this option to work, you need to create a vertex group with the suffix .right or .left. In this case I'll call it group.left and add the geometry you want. Then I'll create another group with the same name, but changing the suffix, and leave it completely empty. If all this setup was done correctly, then after applying the mirror modifier, the geometry from each side will be inside the respective vertex group. If you don't use this option, then all the mirrored geometry will be on the same group as the original vertices. After explaining those basic settings, next to the Select Axis checkboxes there are the other 2 options called Bisect and Flip. What Bisect does is that, when one axis is selected, the geometry outside the positive direction, starting on the mirror modifier origin, will disappear. The Flip option just changes the direction in which the bisect is working, from positive to negative. In an easier explanation to visualize it, most of the time this translates to, if I have some geometry clipping through each other, the Bisect option will cut off that part. To finish this video, on the bottom part of the modifier settings there are some UV options, used to flip the U or V texture coordinates for all the UV island for the mirrored geometry, without having to apply the modifier and do it manually. The offset sliders are used to display the UV island across one or both UV axes, especially useful when using tileable materials, and again, you don't want to apply the modifier and set UVs manually. And those were the last settings I wanted to cover for this video, and a quick summary for everything the mirror modifier has to offer. Thanks for watching and have a nice day.